Welcome to Glass Half Full with Leslie Krongold. She shares her stories, experiences, and knowledge of living and coping with a chronic health condition. Learn about tools and resources and hear inspirational interviews that help you to live a life filled with quality and dignity. With 2 decades of support group leadership, Leslie's ready to help you make lemonade out of life's lemons. Are you ready?
Hello, and welcome to this podcast. If this is your first time listening and you enjoy this episode, I hope you'll check out the first 21 podcast episodes or the ones that interest you. The best way to gauge what's discussed in each podcast is by the title, as well as the tag words that appear to the left of the podcast notes. And you'll only find the podcast notes and tags on the website glasshalffull.online. The tags for the previous episode were goals, hope, multiple sclerosis, myotonic dystrophy, and Parkinson's disease. Now, if those tags and the title don't resonate with you, you might still want to try listening to the episode. I just wanted to give a plug to these other episodes. I'm quite fond of them. So let's chat about this episode. Several years ago, I found the book, How to Be Sick. I can't remember how I found it, if I'd read a review or was just intrigued by the title, but I'm glad I found it. Although the author, Toni Bernhard, didn't have a similar diagnosis as mine, I still found so much of what she spoke, or rather wrote about, to relate to. I recommended the book to people in my support group, and even had it featured at one of the annual conferences for my community of adults with neuromuscular disease. And then last year I started this podcast. As you may realize, I've interviewed a lot of people I've known, people with chronic health conditions and people who work with a healing modality. If I stick to people I know, well, my podcast days will be numbered, so I knew I had to reach further. So I started trying my best to contact authors and others who have inspired and taught me. Toni Bernhard was one of the first people to respond quite openly to my inquiry. Not everyone I've tried to contact responds, unfortunately. Before Toni and I spoke, though, I wanted to make sure I'd read her most recent book, How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Illness. Soon after I read the book, we spoke via Skype in December. Unfortunately, when we spoke, I had a cold, so I sounded a little froggy. The good news is I'm feeling a lot better, but my voice lives on, and apparently there are no audio filters that can zap out a cold. I hope you enjoy our conversation. So my first question was really, I wanted to ask you how you would characterize the 3 books that you've written.
How to Be Sick is the first book, and it's the first and the third books address chronic illness, although I have to tell you that many people have read How to Be Sick who are perfectly healthy and have found it very helpful. And I think the reason is the difference in the organization. How to Be Sick is organized around practices and a kind of philosophy of life to help people with coping with chronic pain and chronic illness. And so because the practices are helpful to anybody. And so a lot of people love that book even though they don't have health issues. The third book, which is How to Live Well with Chronic Pain and Chronic Illness, is organized differently. It's organized around the various problems that people encounter and how to best deal with them. And so there are chapters on isolation and loneliness. There are chapters on how to deal with people who don't understand, who don't believe that you're disabled or sick, or who don't understand and aren't supportive. So, and there's a chapter on being young and being chronically ill. So it's like 42 different challenges that people face. So they're similar in that they both discuss coping with chronic illness, finding a measure of peace in your life, but they're just organized differently. The middle book is actually, I think of it as an introduction to Buddhism book, of all things. Mm-hmm. I've been practicing Buddhist for 25 years. For me, it's a practical path, not a religious one. The Buddha was a human being like you and me. And he came up with some very important or helpful insights into life and came up with a lot of practices. And so how to wake up, a Buddhist-inspired guide to navigating joy and sorrow, really sets forth my understanding of his teachings. And the reason I didn't originally think of it as an introduction to Buddhism, but many Buddhist teachers are using it that way. So, because it covers the basics. Mm-hmm. Now, because all of my books are written from personal experience, and I always use stories from my life or stories people have told me to illustrate the points or the practices, there's a lot about chronic illness in How to Wake Up, because I wrote it while I was ill. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the examples in there. So in that sense, all three books are about chronic pain and chronic illness.
How did your Buddhist practice prepare you for living with a chronic illness? And do you ever imagine how differently you would have handled everything if you didn't have this 25 years of practice?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because at the time when I got sick, I got a viral infection which turned into a chronic illness 15 years ago. I'd already been a practicing Buddhist for 10 years. That's where I get my 25 years. Mm-hmm. At first, I really turned away from all that I'd learned because I was really traumatic to have my life turned upside down by this unexpected illness that forced me to retire early from my job and made me pretty much housebound and some days bedbound. The Buddha's teachings I didn't see the relevance. And that's how to Be Sick came about, because 4 to 5 years into the illness, I began to use many of the Buddha's teachings to help me cope with what was happening. And that is what eventually became How to Be Sick. And you asked how his teachings have helped. Well, I could talk for an hour about just say a couple things. One is that the Buddha was very upfront about the human condition. And that's why sometimes people say, oh, that first noble truth is life is suffering. What a pessimistic religion that is. But all the Buddha was doing was telling us, the chapter in How to Be Sick that talks about this is called The Buddha Tells It Like It Is. And what he does is to say, you were born, and this is actually all in the First Noble Truth. This life is suffering is not the right translation. Mm-hmm. He says, you're born, and so you are subject to certain life events, including illness and growing old and being separated from those you love, either by distance or by death. And so he was very, and he also said, not getting what you want, that's where complaining comes in, right? Mm-hmm. Or getting what you don't want, That certainly happened to me when I got sick. And he said, this is something that happens to everybody. When I went back to his teachings, that was the first thing that resonated so strongly for me, was it's as if somebody from 2,500 years ago, someone understood what I was going through and was saying, well, this is part of being alive, is that sometimes bodies get sick. And actually, I mean, it happens to everybody, just in different ways. And this is how it's happening to you. There's nothing wrong with you. And that was the initial eye opener for me, because I had been blaming myself for not recovering. And this is a very common thing I've discovered with people who write to me about my books. They feel released by my writing from self-blame. They've been directing it themselves over these circumstances that they don't control and that happen to everybody. And it's what I had been doing the first years of my illness, until that light bulb went on. And I realized that this was just a normal part of life. And this is how it happened to me. And I needed to learn to live gracefully and purposefully with it, or I was going to add I was going to add a layer of mental suffering to the physical suffering that I experience every day. So that was the initial insight.
Well, that brings up the question about the 3 components of physical discomfort. Could you just elaborate on that? I found it very insightful. Look at pain with this sort of categorization or segmenting.
I do find it. I find it helpful myself in dealing with pain. There's 2 different ways I segment it. And the first is what you're referring to, these 3 components of physical discomfort. And what is interesting is that 2 of the 3 are mental, even though the discomfort's in the body. So, of course, the first is the unpleasant sensation in the body itself, whether it's pain or aching or fatigue. And the second is our emotional reaction to that physical discomfort, which is often frustration, anger, it could be fear, irritation, self-blame, that kind of thing. And the third, so there's that initial emotional reaction, and that's kind of the Buddha's getting what you don't want, and so you react against it. And the third are the stories that we start to spin that are related to the physical discomfort and this emotional reaction. And so if I have a day where I'm experiencing a lot of pain, the stories that, it's one thing to just be able to say, I'm experiencing pain. It's unpleasant. What can I do to make this day as manageable as possible? But instead, what we tend to do is start spinning stories. And that's where the real mental suffering resides. Like, this pain will never go away. I'll never have another pain-free day. I'll never be able to do anything useful in life because I'm always in pain. Those stories that we spin. And actually, there's Buddhist teachers and often say the suffering is in the stories. And I certainly find that to be true in my life. So those are the 3 components of physical pain. And sometimes I don't put this in the book because I'm really not writing the last book as a Buddhist book. It's just that I'm so influenced by Buddhism, of course. But in Buddhism, that's known as the second arrow. the first arrow is you're experiencing physical discomfort, or particularly pain is what we're talking about here. That's the first arrow. The second arrow is the mental overlay, the second and third components, that reactive mind that reacts in anger or frustration instead of being able to say, oh, yes, pain is present, pain is present, and not react to it, because it's those reactions that set off the stories. So number 2 and 3 are we often called the second arrow, the unnecessary arrow. Now, having said that, I don't put me on a pedestal. I'm I have to work with this every day. It's not that easy. Simply be mindful of physical sensation and not start spinning the stories. But with practice, you get better at it. And you're able to say, well, this is what's going on right now. Let me not start predicting a future which which is unlikely to come. Most of our predictions about the future don't spin out the way we've predicted them. It takes practice. It's really a mindfulness practice in the sense of becoming aware. When people talk about mindfulness, there's usually an emphasis on what's outside of ourselves. Be mindful of the trees and the sound of the birds. And I'm kind of changing subjects here, but for me, the true value of mindfulness is to become aware of what's going on in my mind. Because that's where the mental suffering is. That's where that's where I make things worse for myself.
It's interesting for me to see the language for this, because I've always felt that what I try to do when I have pain, I know it's exacerbated by the anxiety that I experience about it. And that anxiety could be, I could use the words you use about separating it into, the emotional reaction and then the fear and everything that I'm predicting. This is my future, a new baseline, etc. And when
I know that one.
Right.
New baseline. Yeah.
So it's trying to really become, for me, my experience is just trying to really identify, okay, this is the anxiety. If I can control the anxiety, I will still have the pain, but it won't be exacerbated, because that's where it becomes kind of unbearable for me.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about doing, Leslie. And it's another reason it's helpful is that that kind of emotional reaction can actually exacerbate the physical symptoms, because we tighten muscles. Sometimes we tighten muscles around the point of pain. And so then we've got secondary pain from that. Emotions are felt in the body. So the separation body-mind is artificial to some extent. It's certainly helpful to be able to distinguish them in that way. But it's also true that when we learn to recognize how our emotional reactions are making things worse for us, that also helps us relax our bodies. And so that can help with pain too.
The afterwards certainly caught me by surprise. And I was, of course, sorry to read about your diagnosis. And I wondered if this experience going through, I guess, different treatment and such, and having an acute illness has given you a different perspective. And will you be writing a book about it?
Well, here's what I'm doing. I'm not right. Yeah, you mentioned the afterward. I should explain that it was 2 years ago, actually, almost exactly, that I was diagnosed. I had a lump removed from my breast and underwent treatment. and the prognosis is good. But I had just finished polishing the manuscript with my editor for the book that you just read when I got this diagnosis. And I actually called her up and said, well, we can't publish this book. It's not truthful anymore because now I have breast cancer. To throw it out and start over.
Oh.
And we talked about different options. And what we decided was to just include an afterword that talks about, it's just 3 pages that explains what happens and says a few other things about it. So a few months ago, my publisher asked if I would do a new edition of my first book, How to Be Sick, which was published 6 years ago. I jumped at the opportunity because what I'm doing is revising and expanding it in several ways. One is to include mental illness because I've had a lot of people write to me about how my books have helped with that, even though I didn't set out to address that. And another thing is that I'm able to add some practices and some other ideas. And in that, I do talk about, when I give examples or explain how these things have worked for me, I talk about the breast cancer and the worries and the fears and the dealing with side effects of medication and all that kind of thing. So I am writing about it, and it will show up in that book in 2 years because the publication date is fall 2018. It takes a while from the inception to actually to do all the things involved in getting a book published, which I knew nothing about before I entered into that stream. And I wrote one piece about it for Psychology Today. I will be writing about it. Actually, breast cancer is best thought of as a chronic illness because I didn't realize this, but it's ongoing in the sense that after initial treatment, then there are medications to try to prevent recurrence. And those medications have side effects that can lead a person to have to weigh quality of life against how much. They do a statistical analysis for you that tells you if you take this pill, it will reduce the risk of recurrence a certain percentage. And there are women who decide to go off the pills because they have diminished their quality of life to the extent that they'd rather take the risk. And that's an individual decision. Hopefully you have an oncologist who is supportive of discussing that with you and weighing the pros and cons. Some of them just want you to take the meds. But hopefully you have someone who understands how difficult it can be. So it's been 2 years. I'm still a breast cancer patient. I just saw my doctor last week, actually. So the only thing that I wished we had time to talk about are some of the practices that come under a heading of that are called the Sublime states in Buddhism. Wishing others well, compassion, feeling joy for others when they're happy, and equanimity. Those are the 4 sublime states. And I spend every one of my books emphasizes them because when I started my little Buddhist rap by saying the Buddha tells it like it is, and some people find that depressing. Well, the good news is that we can overcome so much of our fears and frustrations through these positive practices, cultivating friendliness towards others and toward ourselves, compassion, which means reaching out to others and to yourself when you're suffering, being being kind to yourself. People write to me about my books, people who are chronically ill. The most common thing they say, if I were to keep track, I just know from reading the emails, is that until they read my books, it never occurred to them to treat themselves with compassion, to be kind to themselves. They thought they didn't deserve it. Well, if you don't deserve, if you're not going to be kind to yourself, who is? In my view, there's never a good reason not to treat yourself kindly. It doesn't mean you can't learn from mistakes, but to allow yourself to live in a state of self-judgment, self-blame, it just makes a difficult life worse. And so it's really important to cultivate compassion and kindness and equanimity, which refers to equanimity as a balanced state of mind in which you accept that life will be a mixture of joys and sorrows and successes and disappointments, and being able to accept that with grace, whether it's the results of an election or how you feel this particular day, to be able to say, oh, I really feel awful today. Well, okay, that's how I feel today. Sometimes, some days, people feel awful. And to be able to accept that without bitterness, and also just with some historical perspective that life has always been this way for everybody, a mixture of joys and sorrows. So that's kind of a short version of equanimity. So that's the only thing we didn't talk about, are some of these positive mind states that are helpful to cultivate. And I write about them in all of my books.
Well, actually, it's funny. I did have a question about the three, attitudes that you cultivate, and equanimity was the one that was most interesting because, well, one, it's not a word that, I've heard the word, but I've never used it. So it was very interesting to read about, and I was going to ask you that. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Good, yeah. Well, that's just the translation of a Pali term, Pali being the language the Buddha spoke. The term is upekkha, and it's been translated into English as equanimity, which is, given how it is described, it's a good translation. If you look equanimity up in the dictionary, you'll find it says, basically a balanced state of mind, being able to ride life's ups and downs without being tossed about. And it's also something that is something you have to work on every day. If I were equanimous 100% of the time, I'd consider myself enlightened. That would be good enough for me.
Well, we could just keep trying.
Yes. Try. Or there's a Zen teacher who has the expression, keep a try mind. And I love that. I just love that.
Well, thank you so much, Toni. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I really appreciate the 2 books I've read, and I will read your other one. Good.
Yeah, I think you'll enjoy the other one. It's an easy read, because turns out that's the way I write. A very conversational style. So I'm glad you'll have a look at it.
Thank you for listening to Glass Half Full. Leslie invites you to leave a rating and review on iTunes. This helps spread the word to others dealing with chronic health issues. For show notes, updates, and more, visit the website glasshalffull.online. Glasshalffull.online.